Whose idea was it to have a party instead of a funeral? Farid asked. I think it's absolutely brilliant. You must have saved a fortune. Don't say that, Farid, Dolly responded, mortified by her husband's insensitive remark, especially after their conversation in the car on the way over. Noreen stared impassively at her guests and heaved a loud sigh to indicate her displeasure.
Hello and welcome to the Southasia Review of Books podcast from Himal Southasian, where we speak to celebrated authors and emerging literary voices from across South Asia. Today is Tuesday the 16th of April. I'm your host Shwetha Srikanthan, Assistant Editor at Himal Southasian, coming to you from Colombo, and here with us today is Taha Kehar, joining us from Karachi to talk about his latest novel, No Funeral for Nazia. Rituals of mourning are a huge part of cultures across South Asia. But as a society, we don't often speak about grief and death. The decision about what happens to us after death is one of the most personal choices we make. It's a choice that might be rooted in family wishes, cultural expectations, religious traditions, personal preference, or all of the above. But in No Funeral for Nazia, a richly imagined mystery set in Karachi, the author Taha Kehar presents an intriguing alternative. In her final days, the protagonist Nazia writes a diary of instructions for her sister Noreen, as well as 6 letters to be delivered after her death. There is to be no funeral. Instead, only 6 invitees are asked to attend a party, including one mystery guest, where various truths and long-held grudges are revealed throughout the night, and we witness the entangled relationships between these characters and Nazia. The story also traces gender and class dynamics in Karachi society, as well as past-present events of Pakistani politics, giving us a sweeping glimpse of the country's urban life, which we'll explore further in today's conversation. Taha Kehar is a novelist, journalist, and literary critic based in Karachi. A law graduate from SOAS London, Taha is the co-editor of a multi-author anthology titled The Stained Glass Window, Stories of the Pandemic from Pakistan. Taha is also the author of 3 novels, his debut of Rift and Rivalry, Typically Tanya, published in 2018, and his latest novel, No Funeral for Nazia, which we'll be discussing today. Taha, welcome to the Southasia Review of Books podcast, and thank you so much for joining us to talk about your riveting new novel.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for saying such lovely things about my book.
In the book, the protagonist Nazia dictates the terms by which she would be remembered and grieved after her death. She wants her sister Noreen to fulfill her last wishes by hosting a party instead of a funeral. Could you tell us about how you came up with this premise of an anti-funeral, and are there any elements drawn from personal experiences that shape this narrative?
So curiously enough, my desire to explore this anti-funeral, so to speak, stems from this need to explore the story through the lens of a protagonist who was absent throughout the narrative. My previous novel, Typically Tanya, was told in the first-person narrative, and the protagonist, Tanya Shaukat, was an overpowering presence throughout the book, to the extent that other minor characters, to a large extent, subdued by that strong voice. So I wanted to reverse things around. I wanted the other characters in my book to talk about the protagonist, to evoke her memory, to bring her to life through their own observations and experiences of her. So that was my main purpose at this point. How do I achieve this balance that Daphne du Maurier achieved in her novel Rebecca, where the entire narrative does not include the protagonist, Rebecca? So death was the only and perhaps ultimate means through which I could achieve that absence. Unfortunately, I didn't want to create a book or a character who was forgettable just because she had died. So I wanted her to be somewhat unconventional, someone who stood out. And that's where this idea of the anti-funeral came in, where she wanted a party instead of a funeral. So in order to make her memorable, I decided that the best thing to do would be to get a few of her friends over, have a party in a very informal setting, but then there were certain twists and turns. And I suppose that when I was writing this novel, there were no personal experiences. And to some extent, this novel wrote itself. I was perhaps subconsciously aware of the alternative rituals of grieving. I used to think about death quite a lot because the conversation surrounding death has always been a difficult one to have. I don't think we discuss death as readily with our children or even as adults. So, what do you do when someone dies? Some people drown themselves in rituals and they find solace in them. I personally also find solace in the rituals associated with death. But then, does that really allow you to process death in the way you would want to? Does it allow you to have a conversation about it? So, obviously, these things were going through my mind. Months after my first draft was done, I found out that my mother was unwell. And that came as a shock to me because she was perfectly young and she was in her early 60s. So, it was a bit difficult. But I realized that having written this book, I was able to come to terms with her illness, come to terms with her subsequent death. I have to also highlight the fact that No Funeral for Nazia, even though it deals with the theme of grieving, it's not really dealing with every aspect of grief. Grief is an intricate process. We have Elizabeth Kubler-Ross telling us about the 5 stages of grief. And the reality is that grief isn't linear. It doesn't follow a very predictable path. So the characters who are, so to speak, mourning Nazia at her anti-funeral, they aren't really grieving her in the right way. They're just dealing with whatever is happening at that point in time. And grief will hit them much later. They'll understand things in a much more cohesive manner as time passes, and maybe they'll never even understand it. That's how complicated grief is.
Thank you for sharing that, Taha.
Yeah.
The novel also explores Karachi's troubled past.
Mm-hmm.
There are conversations on the declining value of the Pakistani rupee, IMF, the MQM, Muhajir nationalist movement of the 1990s, Imran Khan, PTI, and so much more. At one point in the novel, the journalist Farid says, "We can't even present critical opinions of the government of the day. It's a tragedy," which rings true of Pakistan today. So, how did your background as a journalist shape No Funeral for Nazia? And how did you approach writing a story set within this ethno-political context of Karachi?
It's fascinating because I was driven to write this novel because I wanted to tell a linear story. I wanted a story that didn't delve too much into the past. But at some point I realized that whatever is happening in the present, it has something to do with Karachi's past. I couldn't completely ignore the past. As a journalist, I was not much of a reporter. I used to edit stories and I was very heavily involved with political storytelling at the time. So I would write occasionally about Karachi. And one of the things I realized was that when the MQM was, as I like to say, that their wings were clipped in Karachi by the powers that be, there was some sense of uncertainty at that point. Everyone went around saying now things will get better for the city. People will emerge from their cocoons. People will start living the way they want to live. And I grew up in a Karachi that was paralyzed by the occasional violence that we got to see every now and again. I was always very skeptical about whether order will be restored. And that skepticism drove me into it. I realized at one point then that even if we are in this very moment, the contemporary moment, the past will continue to crawl its way back. So we need to understand the past, dissect it in some way, and try to come to terms with it. The other thing I was, as you mentioned, writing fiction about Karachi. Karachi has never really been much of a literary city. It has over the years become a literary plaything where quite a few writers have written about Karachi, fiction and non-fiction. But one thing I wanted to do was to avoid the stereotypical depiction of Karachi. As we know, we have lazy reportage in the Western media about Pakistan as this terrorist state. And that just colors every perception you have about the city or any other city of Pakistan. So I wanted to avoid that. I wanted to talk about how even though Karachi went through decades of ethnopolitical tensions, there were people who were affected by it directly and there were people who were indirectly affected. And there were some people who were never affected by it. So I wanted there to be some contrast in that regard. I wanted there to be some awareness that the people who live here aren't just victims of terror or perpetrators even. I wanted to remind people that we are people, essentially. There's a point in the novel where there are riots going on in the city, and Nazia goes over to Dolly's publishing house for the very first time after meeting her at her office. And while the riots are going on, these two women sit there and read Nazia's first manuscript. For me, that is a very special moment because it reminds me that even though there were so many tensions, there were minds that were at work at that point. There were people who were thinking, who were pondering over creative pursuits, improving their minds. And that is essentially what is missed out in that lazy reportage that I spoke about earlier. So I wanted that to come through. Karachi has also been a city that is very misunderstood. Even people who live in it find it very difficult to come to terms with what it has to offer sometimes. So I wanted to capture that chaos as well. At the same time, I was also aware that what I was writing about was just a particular set of Karachi. I did not want to write a book that was representative because it's a vast city. It's a bustling metropolis with so many people, so many ethnicities. You can't possibly capture every dimension of that city in one book. But I just told a story that I felt resonated with me, resonated with the rhythm and the spirit of the city at a particular point in time, and also showed the difference between Karachi's past and its present.
It's very interesting to hear about the different ways that Karachi is captured in literature. One of the major reveals in the book is that Nazia urges the group to undergo hypnosis as a final request, and it is through the process of hypnotherapy that the characters work through the complicated feelings they have towards Nazia. There's even a report that comes up in the story from the group who are skeptical about this, about a gang of thieves who would hypnotize people at various traffic signals across Karachi. And upon some research, I found that this is actually based on real incidents, with the most recent case, I think, from last year. Mm-hmm. And you also write that, and I quote, "In a country where the very weather has become an existential threat, few had the luxury apparently of pausing to consider their mental health. Some had even expressed concerns that hypnotherapy was a Western incarnation of dabbling with the black arts and jinn," end quote. Could you tell us about some of the research that went into highlighting hypnotherapy in this novel, where you use it almost as a literary device, and why you were drawn to it as a means to discuss stigma around mental health in South Asia?
So it's a funny story because when I gathered all these people at this party, I didn't know what to do with them in the first draft, at least. I was struggling to find something. And then one fine day I said, you know what? They need to address so many of these problems that they're talking about. Everybody on the page was fighting with the other. Parveen was fighting with Noreen and Dolly. Then the men were fighting. There was so much conflict, and I felt there needed to be a way to resolve this conflict. And one of the things I realized midway was that I had probably created a very Agatha Christie-esque world where I'd gathered all these people at a party, and I had the mystery setting, but I wanted to subvert that setting somehow. I didn't want it to be a stereotypical mystery novel with the usual tropes of mystery writing. So I said, let me look into ways in which I can help them understand what they're going through, each of these characters. I came upon hypnotherapy as a means of doing that. I had to obviously unlearn quite a few things about what hypnotherapy entails. I did a lot of research. I read through some transcripts of people going through hypnotherapy, and I realized that hypnotherapists have used this device for various reasons. They've used it to help people deal with IBS, to deal with sleep apnea or something like that. There have been so many purposes that it's been used for, but it's used over a prolonged period of time. It doesn't happen as a one-off process. It needs to be something that is consistently practiced, and it needs to really be something you work on. So I didn't want them to engage too deeply with hypnotherapy because I knew that my characters were averse to any form of therapy, let alone hypnotherapy. And at the same time, I was aware that this is a mystery setting. Surely I need a detective. Surely I need to do something to incorporate hypnotherapy and a detective. So then I came up with this character of Salman Narang, who would walk in and terrify them. In many ways, Salman is like a detective. He walks in, he says, okay, someone has died. It's Nazia, and there's no murderer, but in some way, all of you are morally responsible for whatever has gone wrong in her life. And let's deal with that. But let's make it about you. This is not about figuring out who did what and who is to blame for anything. You're not going to go through any scrutiny for it. Just allow the process to, work on you. It'll work its own magic on you. At the same time, I was also aware that the kind of engagement these characters would have with this process wouldn't really be something very long term for it to have any effect. So even in each of these hypnotherapy sessions, characters may not be telling the truth, may not be exploring certain facets of the truth. So in a way, some of them reach the resolutions. Maybe those resolutions are somewhat contrived. Some of them just do it because they're like, you know what, you expected us to do it. Nazia, we'll do it for you. So it was a bit challenging, but I primarily wanted it to be like a detective story with a postmodern touch, something a little different from what usual mystery novels are like, because mystery novels are filled with tropes. I wasn't interested in just writing a mystery novel, and it's forgettable. I wanted it to be something more memorable than that, something that talks about gender, about class. So.
Before we welcome you to read an excerpt from the book, I'd like to take a moment to invite our listeners to check out our Patreon program to support Himal's in-depth independent coverage, including some of the most wide-ranging book reviews from around the region that relies on the support of our listeners like you. Southasia Review of Books is a podcast and a monthly newsletter that threads together our latest reviews and literary interviews. You'll find a special reading list curated by Taha Kehar in this month's edition, so do sign up to keep up with our latest reviews, podcasts, and more. Now, Taha, over to you to read an excerpt from No Funeral for Nazia.
Okay, so there's a part of this book that I have a special attachment to. I'm still trying to figure out why. Every time I read it, it gives me a different feeling. About 38 pages in, they're at this party, and I'm trying not to give too many spoilers away. So I'll just begin. Is Dolly and Fareed, who are guests, and Noreen, who is Nazia's sister, and obviously Parveen, who is her arch nemesis and former best friend. So here it goes. Whose idea was it to have a party instead of a funeral? Fareed asked. I think it's absolutely brilliant. You must have saved a fortune. Don't say that, Fareed, Dolly responded, mortified by her husband's insensitive remark, especially after their conversation in the car on the way over. Noreen stared impassively at her guests and heaved a loud sigh to indicate her displeasure. Fareed's smugness was irritating, but hospitality prevented her from telling him off. I think you did the right thing, Parveen's voice ricocheted through the drawing room. People spend so much on funerals these days. They're such impersonal affairs. You can't even grieve properly. She paused, tilted her head back and chugged her wine, leaving red drops on her chin. Mrs. Sadiq, my neighbor, attended a male colleague's funeral some weeks ago, she continued, sloppily rubbing her knuckles against her lips. They had worked together for 29 years at the bank and had become good friends. But poor Mrs. Sadiq just couldn't cry at the funeral. She didn't want her colleague's wife to become suspicious. As it is, Mr. Sadiq is a jealous sort and had insisted on accompanying her to the funeral. Imagine what he would think if he found his wife crying at some other man's funeral. Noreen guffawed happily as she heard the story. Something about Mrs. Sadiq's dilemma seemed to make her lose her equanimity and urbane refinement. Had she been hosting a funeral, such behavior would have been frowned upon as a sign of disrespect towards the deceased. But this was different. Through her unconventional demands, Nazia had released her from the constraints of mourning and its etiquettes. For the first time, Noreen admired Nazia's benevolence, the freedom that her death had provided them. She could be herself or whoever else she wanted to be. This passage means a lot to me because in many ways it tells us about how grieving is a complicated process and it varies from person to person how they would approach that process.
Thank you for that reading, Taha. And that excerpt also is an example of what I wanted to discuss in the next question. The novel at its core explores how women are perceived and how they perceive each other in Pakistani society, whether that's between friends, mothers, daughters, siblings, or even lovers. For example, Nazia's unfinished manuscript is titled A Woman Without Men, Perhaps that's giving us a hint that the men might actually be the source of all the conflict between these women. And another important point of social commentary in the novel is that of the power dynamic between the privileged employer and the domestic workers. So could you tell us about how and why you chose to highlight these aspects of gender and class in contemporary Karachi society?
So it's fascinating. The manuscript you mentioned, A World Without Men, is Nazia's first manuscript. And the final manuscript, which was the last one, is called Three Different Men. So the titles are very interesting because she starts off with a complete rejection of men from her life. And it obviously stems from a very place in her heart because Nazia's husband abandons her with a daughter, and she has to move in with her sister and her husband to look after the child. And she's also trying to escape from her husband's enemies in a way. So in a way, she tries to construct her life again without them. And one of the things I have realized is that while people assume that patriarchy affects men and women in different ways, I think women suffer more because patriarchal institutions find that dividing and separating women from one another, it sort of enhances their hegemony, their control. So that's essentially how this novel begins. Most of these women are in conflict with each other. And they don't realize until much later that it was probably the men who were the root of all that conflict, who had maybe inadvertently or maybe even consciously sowed the seeds of all that hostility. Obviously, the reader's never told what those manuscripts are all about. It would be interesting to write a manuscript that a character has written. But at that point, she's trying to completely break away from that and make a space for herself in the world, carve it out in a way that she doesn't have to be driven by these patriarchal demands in any way. And then right at the end of her life, she writes this more autobiographical account, which she titles Three Different Men. And that is essentially the story of her life. And she goes back to understanding, and only one character tells us what that book is about. Dolly tells us that even though it's about these three different men who love the same woman, it's not really about the romance between these three men and that woman. It's about the woman's relationship with three other women who loved these men. And it's perhaps a recognition of some of the mistakes Nazia made over the course of her life. She may have disappointed certain friends of hers, and the friends consequently also disappointed her. So I just feel when it comes to gender dynamics, it's very easy for people to say that television shows, they pit women against each other. It's just a very common trope. It's a very stereotypical trope, but very few stories celebrate female friendship. And even if they celebrate female friendships, they are given that moniker of this is a chick lit, this is women's fiction. But essentially, friendship between women is one area that is heavily underrated. With regard to your other question about class, Bijan and Suraya, who are the two domestics in the story, they exist purely to provide a counter to this anti-funeral, so to speak. So Nazia is in a position in her life, and her friends as well, where they can defy rituals and traditions, and they can come up with their own rituals. If she wants to have a party instead of a funeral, so be it. But there's a certain class of people who may not find that appropriate, who may find comfort in rituals. And these two women, Bijan and Suraya, provide that counter in that sense. But it's not that they are just the naysayers in the account. They are also indirectly being affected by it, and that too negatively. So this process of hypnotherapy happens in a very consensual manner with all the other guests. The only people whose consent is not sought is Bijan and Suraya. So this raises the question that the people who work for us, is it easier for us to say that, okay, we pay your salary, so you have to do everything we do, even if that means being forcibly hypnotized and taken into a room? And I'm giving out a little bit too much of a spoiler, but it's just, for me, it was very important to pay attention to those class dynamics, because every society, at least in South Asia and across the world, there are inequalities, and those inequalities exist within our homes as well, and we don't even realize it sometimes. There are subtle differences, and for me, this process, this experiment that Nazia decided to carry out with the hypnotherapy, there had to be a counter to it as well. There had to be someone to raise a question about it, because while it's therapeutic, it may also have its pitfalls.
Thank you for that, Taha. Speaking of mysteries, the publishing scene in Pakistan is one of the most mystifying of all. And there's little information about the inner workings of the trade, and this is also a mostly overlooked topic in South Asian literature. In your book, the character Dolly runs her own publishing company, and Nazia is a celebrated author. And we get a look behind the curtain of how her work gets published by Dolly. So could you tell us about some of the challenges of publishing in Pakistan, and also about any emerging trends you've spotted in Pakistan's publishing world?
So it's unfortunate that Pakistan's publishing industry is not as a thriving industry. India is doing very well. Quite a few multinationals have come to India and they've set up excellent publishing houses that are publishing great books. Unfortunately, in Pakistan, primarily you will come across publishers who are publishing textbooks. In recent years, Dolly is running her own publishing house where she's publishing fiction and she's trying to capture the local literary idiom, as she calls it. Quite a few small publishing houses have also emerged like that over the years. Some of them are still operational and they're producing interesting books, but the reality of publishing in Pakistan is that it isn't a profitable venture. Not too many people want to read fiction from Pakistan, even non-fiction. It's a very niche category. I suppose publishing books generally is something very niche at the moment. But in recent years, some terrific publishers have emerged. Reverie Publishing has emerged from Karachi. Folio Books as well. There's a small publishing house by the name of Ushba. They're all publishing some interesting books, but unfortunately, it all boils down to outreach. One of the things I've noticed about contemporary Pakistani writing is that we're now venturing into different genres. There was a time when everything that you got to read from Pakistan had a literary touch to it. Literary fiction was very popular, and it still is to a large extent. It was very difficult to come across a mystery novel, a horror novel, anything, ghost stories. So I think now that's rapidly changing. Younger people they're more experimental with what they write.
Thank you, Taha. And I hope books like No Funeral for Nazia carves the space for more books from diverse genres to come out of Pakistan.
That's very kind of you to say.
That also brings me to my last question of the episode. In No Funeral for Nazia, the overall narrative evokes a uniquely South Asian sense of mystery and drama that's almost akin to the drama we get in serials or teledramas from around the region. And it's also very rare to come across a mystery novel that not only has a narrative that's driven by women, but it's also set in Pakistan. Could you tell us about your approach to writing within this genre? And also share your reading recommendations for contemporary mystery novels from around South Asia.
So the thing about South Asian mystery novels is that, I grew up reading very few novels that were authentically South Asian mystery novels. Primarily, we read a lot of Agatha Christie, and that was our way into mystery. But one thing I realized is that there are very few studies that have actually tried to explore this genre in more detail. We see a lot of work being done on literary fiction from South Asia, but very little on this very specific category of fiction. Maybe it has something to do with the fact that mystery novels are considered forgettable. You read them, you explore every aspect of them. There's this term that we use in the South Asian context, which is time pass. You need to spend 2 hours to read something. You read it and you forget about it. But there's so much more that one can accomplish with the mystery novel. I personally enjoy mystery novels that bend the genre and try to explore various issues within the context of mystery. There are some novels that I came across recently, and even in my readings over the last few years, some of them are from India primarily, and a few are by Tamil writers. I'll actually share my list with you. So one of the books that I came across a few years ago, it's called Murder at the Happy Home for the Aged. It's by Bulbul Sharma. She's an Indian writer. This novel is set in Goa. There's a murder in an old age home. And there's a group of amateur detectives who are, they're octogenarians from what I recall. And they're constantly told, look, this is really not your age to be out there solving mysteries. Why don't you go and sing some devotional songs and prepare for death? And they don't do that. They solve the mystery. So that's what I enjoyed about it. The thing about mystery novels is that I think back in the day, many of these detectives we came across were truth seekers. They were trying to find out those things that were not being explored in detail, that were being concealed from all of us. So in a way, in the colonial context, I think someone who is a truth seeker is a problematic figure, but at the same time, very much a powerful person. So what I really enjoy about some of these novels that I came across was that they were set in the colonial context. There's a book by the name of Death at the Darbar. It's by Arjun Raj Gaind. It's set during the British Raj, and the sleuth in the situation is a Maharaja. And it's fascinating because it's a commentary on British imperialism. There is a courtesan who dies, and it's all set in 1911. It's fascinating. There's another book by the name of A Murder in Malabar Hills by Sujata Massey, and it features a female detective, again in the 20s. It's very interesting because she's not only just an amateur sleuth, she is one of the first female lawyers in India. And so there's a lot of gender confrontation she has to deal with to, find her way through, and she manages to solve a mystery, which is fascinating. I believe this female detective's name was Parveen Mistry. So that struck me as interesting. And then there were some novels I came across over the years that were written in other languages. I feel it's not just necessary to write about or speak about novels written in English. Some novels that are available to us in translation are also valuable. There is a Tamil writer named Shwetha Rajan. I may not be pronouncing this correctly, but there was a novel, it was titled Anita, a Trophy Wife. Slightly stereotypical, but it was interesting to see how the element of mystery was merged. Then obviously there is, from the Bengali side of fiction, we have Byomkesh Bakshi, who is a very famous detective. Shows have been made about him. Films have been made about him as well. And I believe a few of his stories are available in translation. I forget the name of the Bengali writer who wrote about Byomkesh Bakshi, but it's worth thinking about as well, because there's so much to explore about the sleuth. What is the role of the sleuth in a mystery setting, and how can we work on that, and how can we build on that in some ways and produce fiction that is memorable and interesting at the same time.
Thank you, Taha. That list of books sound excellent, and I can't wait to get my hands on them. And thank you again for an excellent discussion and for taking the time to speak with us today. It was an absolute pleasure to have you on the show.
It was a pleasure to be on the show. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Southasia Review of Books podcast from Himal Southasian. This episode was edited by Ritika Chauhan. If you like this episode, please share widely, rate, review, subscribe, and download the show on your favorite podcast apps. You can find Taha Kehar's reading list for the episode in this month's Southasia Review of Books newsletter. You can find the links to subscribe and listen to previous episodes on our website at himalmag.com. Thanks again, and until next time.